When Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine failed, it thought it would be able to grind out a victory through sheer numbers alone. The skies barely came into the equation. Tanks, artillery, people, they would be the key as long as Russia could deploy them in massive numbers. A lot has changed since then. Drones now dominate the battlefield, and it's drones that are now destroying Russia from the inside, making it almost impossible for it to win the Ukraine war. Kyiv zeroes in on Russia's blind spots, making Putin's defeat inevitable. It all comes down to a key mistake Russia has been making since the start of the war, being overly focused on Crimea. That's according to Euromaidan Press, which said on September 18th that Ukrainian Navy spokesperson Dmytro Pletenchuk has spotted a gap in the Russian armor. Crimea is Russia's weak point. Not because Ukraine keeps attacking the peninsula, though it does, but because Russia is so determined to defend Crimea that it's sacrificing its air defenses elsewhere. Russia is protecting occupied Crimea better than its oil refineries. Moscow is constantly boosting air defense systems in the peninsula with the most advanced systems in response to Ukraine's strikes. Euromaidan Press reports Pletenchuk as stating, "That's all well and good. However, the problem comes from the fact that diverting these air defenses to Crimea means that opportunities arise elsewhere. Ukraine is taking advantage. Vladimir Putin's single-minded focus on the peninsula he annexed in 2014 means that he's not taking care of perhaps the single most important resource the Russian military has: refined oil. Russia needs refined oil for everything its military does. Refined oil products like diesel, gasoline, and aviation fuel keep Russia's aircraft and mechanized units going. As long as Russia is making these products in abundance, it can also sell them to the countries willing to skirt Western sanctions, making billions in the process. However, it's the abundance part that is the problem. With Russia being so reliant on refined oil, while also doing nowhere near enough to protect its refineries due to Putin having a Crimea-shaped blind spot, Ukraine has been taking out refineries left, right, and center with long-range drone strikes. Ukraine's refinery strikes have ramped up in 2025 in general, and specifically since the beginning of August. On August 29th, UKR Inform reported that even the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has acknowledged the impact that Ukraine's strikes are having on Russia's refineries. Speaking about a then-recent Russian strike on Kyiv, Leavitt said, "Russia launched this attack on Kyiv, and likewise, Ukraine recently dealt a blow to Russia's oil refineries. They have taken out, as a matter of fact, 20% of Russia's oil refining capacity over the course of their attacks throughout the month of August." Reuters added to this the day after, noting that Russia's offline refining capacity had reached a record high of 6.4 million tons per month by the end of August. That was 65% higher than Russia estimated per its scheduled refinery maintenance plan, and it shows that Putin made a grave error by ordering air defenses to Crimea instead of having them guard Russia's refineries. The loss of all this refined oil has several impacts on Russia. The most obvious of these impacts is felt on the battlefield. When gasoline and diesel aren't being pumped out of Russia's refineries, those products aren't making their way to Russia's soldiers. Tanks can't run on fumes, neither can armored vehicles. If Ukraine is also taking out refineries that produce aviation fuel, that means Russia can't launch any missiles and glide bombs at Ukraine's cities either. What Putin has done is unveil Russia's jugular and invited Ukraine to take as many swipes at that critical vein as it wants. Ukraine has obliged. The country's constant barrage of strikes also hurt Russia financially, as Al Jazeera reports. It says, Ukraine has launched a two-pronged strategy this year to choke off fuel supplies to the Russian economy and military and to kill Russian revenues from energy exports. There are plenty of statistics that highlight how well the second part of the strategy is working. According to the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, Russia's revenue from fossil fuel exports, which is a category into which many of its refined oil products fall, declined by 2% in August 2025, when compared to the same month in 2024. Worse yet for Russia, that 2% drop was the third decline in as many months, showcasing that Ukraine's constant chipping away at Russia's refining capacity is having an effect. On the wider spectrum, oilprice.com reports that Russia's overall oil and gas revenues are set to decline by 23% in September 2025 year-on-year, again highlighting how Ukraine's hitting Russian energy hard is draining Putin's war chest. If Ukraine carries on like this, Russia may run out of money for its war. And if Russia doesn't start moving air defenses out of Crimea to guard its refineries, there'll be no reason for Ukraine to stop. Russia's gasoline sales have also hit a two-year low, Politico reported on September 18th. Sales of A92 petroleum have fallen by 21.7%, hitting 15,600 metric tons. That's the lowest level since 2023. A95 petroleum sales are also down, this time 15.5%, to 12,060 tons. These are the sorts of sharp declines Russia has been dealing with for months due to the unscheduled shutdowns of several of its refineries, Politico says. As one SBU official told the outlet, the SBU systematically blocks the flow of petrodollars to the Russian military budget. Each bombardment at a Russian refinery reduces the aggressor's ability to fight against Ukraine. Things aren't looking much better domestically for Russia. By the end of August, The Guardian was reporting that Russia is dealing with a domestic fuel crisis, along with lower sales and an inability to send the fuel its soldiers need to the front lines in Ukraine. Prices surged to record highs during the course of last month, with many gas stations in Russia running dry, to the point where motorists were being forced to queue for hours in the hope of getting their tanks filled. Though far from the first fuel crisis Russia has faced in recent history, this particular crisis is different, as independent gas and oil analyst Boris Aronstein tells The Guardian. This is not the first fuel crisis. It's happened several times before the war, Aronstein notes. The attacks are massive, coordinated and repeated. They come in waves, and refineries simply do not have the time to repair damage caused by the previous attack before the next one occurs. We'll come back to that point about repairs in a moment. For now, Ukraine is showing no signs of slowing down its refinery strikes. Why would it? Putin's decision to reinforce Crimea at the cost of protecting Russia's refineries makes it all too easy to hit his country's oil arteries again and again. That's what Ukraine did on September 20th with drone strikes that hit their targets at refineries in the Samara and Saratov oblasts. Both were repeated targets in August, harkening back to Aronstein's explanation of Ukraine's strategy of repeating its strikes, and both recorded explosions and fires following Ukraine's attack. The blind spot is still vulnerable. It has been for months. Jason J. Smart points this out during a conversation with defense analyst and former US Navy SEAL Chuck Farrar on the Kyiv Post's YouTube channel. They must realize that the situation is getting further and further out of control, and it's not going to get better, Smart says of Russia's military situation. Look at the attacks that we've seen on the oil refineries. Russia is now hard up for oil. We've seen the huge gas lines throughout Russia as well. They're spreading pretty quickly, but more than that, Russia today is losing revenue. Russia can still sell the crude oil and refined oil products it has, Smart notes. But even then it's selling at a loss because the countries that are buying it have to do so by dealing with Russia's shadow fleet due to Western sanctions. More risk creates more leverage for those countries, allowing them to ask for discounts that Putin would never have approved were it not for the war Russia is waging. To compound all of these issues, Russia is struggling to repair its refineries, as we mentioned earlier in the video. Farrar makes this point to Smart when talking about just how impressive Ukraine's drone-centric campaign against Russia's refineries truly is. These are elegantly conducted, Farrar says of the refinery strikes. This is a strategic bombing campaign, the first time in history that a nation without a strategic air force is attacking strategic targets. Watch those videos carefully because the Ukrainians are not just hitting random items in a refinery, they're hitting specific critical components. They hit the things that take 8 months to fix. And why do these components take 8 months to fix? Russia can't get its hands on the components needed to fix them due to Western sanctions. This isn't just the West tooting its own horn when it comes to the effectiveness of sanctions either. Russia says that sanctions are hurting its refinery repairs. Specifically, the Moscow Times reported in July that Russia is well behind its repair schedule, and the country's energy minister, Sergei Savilyev, was surprisingly frank as to the reason why. Why do disruptions sometimes occur? Savilyev asked rhetorically. Because given the sanctions regime we're currently under, we're supposed to have, say, 4 months of repairs planned, but we've been delayed or under-delivered. Bear in mind that these comments were made before Ukraine really ramped up its refinery strikes in August. Russia was already struggling to make repairs in the months prior to Ukraine switching to its repeated strike strategy. Now it's losing critical components at refineries where maintenance was never on the schedule in the first place. Russia has a dwindling stockpile of the parts it needs to make repairs, and it can only stretch those stockpiles so far. And thanks to Putin's decision to send air defense systems to Crimea instead of to Russia's refineries, any repairs that do get made can be undone in an instant by Ukraine's drones. There are no air defenses to stop these drones. Putin has built the rod that is breaking Russia's back. But do you want to know the two great ironies in all of this? First, despite Putin creating a refinery blind spot to protect Crimea, the multitude of air defense units Russia has sent to the peninsula aren't doing their job. Crimea seems to be where Russia sends its air defenses to die. Euromaidan Press highlights this, noting that in August, which is the very same month Ukraine ramped up its refinery strikes, Russia lost several high-value pieces of equipment thanks to Ukraine's drone strikes in Crimea. Among them was an RT-70 radio telescope, a UTOS-T radar system, a coastal radar station, and a GLONASS satellite navigation system dome. But perhaps most embarrassingly, a 96L6 AP radar attached to the very S-400 air defense system that's supposed to be preventing these types of strikes in the first place was also taken out. For all of Putin's Crimea-centric decision-making, the peninsula doesn't seem to be any safer than it would be if Russia had placed its air defenses at its refineries. At this point, you could make the argument that the Crimean air defenses are in place more for the illusory peace of mind of the 800,000 ethnic Russians who've moved to Crimea since the annexation than they are for actual defense. And that brings us to the second irony. None of this may even matter because it's becoming increasingly clear that Russia's air defenses can't deal with Ukraine's drones. The case of the S-400 radar system we just mentioned is one of the many examples of this. Russia's S-500, which is supposed to be the most advanced air defense system that the country has in its arsenal, has also suffered thanks to Ukraine's strikes. Euromaidan press says that this system is supposed to be capable of intercepting ballistic and cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, and strategic aircraft. It can detect targets up to 800 kilometers or 497 miles away, and can strike them at a distance of 600 kilometers or 372 miles. Plus, it can integrate with Russia's S-400, and all for the substantial sum of $600 million per unit. Those are all impressive specifications, but you'll notice that this advanced system, which is now finding its way to Crimea, isn't designed to tackle drones, the one weapon Ukraine is using ahead of all others. And on August 8th, Ukraine demonstrated why that's such an oversight. On that date, United 24 media reported that one of Ukraine's drones had destroyed a 98L6 Yenisei radar system in Crimea. That's the radar system linked to the S-500, meaning a handful of drones that likely cost Ukraine a few tens of thousands of dollars each managed to render the super-advanced S-500 blind. So maybe Putin failing to protect Russia's refineries with air defenses because he's too busy sending those defenses to Crimea doesn't matter. These defenses have been proven ineffective against Ukraine's drones many times. If they're not being hit directly by those drones in Crimea, they're failing to stop the drones from hitting other high-priority targets. Who's to say they would perform better if they were installed at Russia's refineries? They probably wouldn't. But at least a handful of seemingly ineffectual air defenses would be better than nothing at all. If nothing else, they might make Ukraine reconsider risking more expensive long-range drones in its refinery strikes. But Putin went with no defenses instead of some for his refineries. Now Russia is stretched so thin on the air defense front that it can't do anything about it. Refineries are being repeatedly hit. Crimea is still vulnerable, regardless of the presence of Russian air defenses. And what this ultimately adds up to is a major crisis for a Russian military that is on the verge of devouring itself as its attempts to take territory in Ukraine falter. Let's rejoin Smart and Farah for a look at what's happening to Russia's military on the ground in Ukraine. Russia is still launching regular assaults, Farah points out, but its units are doing so at such a distance from one another that supporting each other isn't possible. The assaults are disjointed and, from Ukraine's perspective, relatively easy to handle. Russia's losses have been enormous. The Russians started this summer offensive with 170,000 troops poured into Ukraine, Farah says of the offensive that Putin hoped would break Ukraine's morale and deliver Russia the victory he has wanted since he launched his invasion. Instead, Russia's soldiers went through the meat grinder, and Russia achieved none of the objectives Putin set for the summer. They've lost 210,000 since May, Farah says of Russia's casualty rate. And that is the low end of the estimates that go up to 310,000 casualties. Russia simply isn't capable of launching large assaults anymore, and certainly not of launching the types of coordinated assaults needed to take down Ukraine's strongholds. Massive losses of mechanized units throughout the war play a role in all of this, of course. But we can't ignore the refinery strikes and their impact on the Russian troops fighting in Ukraine. We said it before, taking out the facilities that produce diesel and gasoline means that Russia's soldiers don't have the fuel they need to launch mechanized assaults. Instead, they have to operate in smaller, disjointed units, which brings us back to the point that Farah makes. As long as Putin has a blind spot when it comes to defending Russia's refineries, his soldiers on the ground aren't going to be able to make the advances he wants them to make. All of these issues contribute to Russia's morale falling off a cliff, which is the exact opposite of what Putin wants to achieve. Look, there are murderers of officers, Farah says. There are desertions of entire tactical units, there is cannibalism, there is disease, there is everything you see in a defeated army. The mention of cannibalism is interesting because it isn't something that's been widely reported during the Ukraine war, but it's happening. On June 20th, the Kyiv Independent reported that Ukraine's Military Intelligence Agency, or HUR, had leaked a Russian radio transmission, revealing that at least one Russian soldier is guilty of eating one of his compatriots. Nobody ran away. Braylock took him out and then ate him for 2 fucking weeks, a speaker who HUR identifies as the commander of a reconnaissance unit in Russia's 68th Motorized Rifle Division says in the leaked transmission. Braylock didn't last long himself, as the commander reveals. They say he was a 200, military slang for a killed soldier. Fuck. Well, if he ate his comrade, that's something to think about. Something to think about. Does that mean cannibalism is something that Russia's soldiers should consider if their situation becomes desperate. It's hard to say without the full context of the conversation, but the fact that cannibalism is even on the record as having been discussed and committed reveals a lot about the state of the Russian military right now. And the worst of it may be that Putin likely doesn't even know that these types of things are happening. Smart asks Farah if Russia still has a chance of taking Ukraine. I don't think that's on the cards at all, Farah says. I'm not even sure that Putin knows how bad it is. I do think his generals know at this point. Nobody wants to be the guy to walk to the 70-foot conference table and tell the boss how screwed up everything is. Perhaps that's Putin's biggest problem. He has blind spots because the people surrounding him aren't willing to tell him what's really going on. That's what happens when you surround yourself with sycophants, yes-men, and people who are more concerned with saving their own skin than they are with helping Putin achieve a dream of taking Ukraine that seems to be getting further and further away from Russia's reach. Ukraine's refinery strikes aren't the only cause of these issues on the ground, of course. Over 3.5 years of attritional warfare have taken their toll on Russia, as have a myriad of other issues relating to the brutality of the conflict. But refineries going down, leading to gasoline and diesel failing to reach the front lines, isn't helping matters. Putin's blind spot is causing serious issues for his soldiers right now, and those issues are happening because Putin is defending an annexed territory that he thought would be safe, rather than defending the one resource it really needs to stand any chance of success. Speaking about Crimea, all of the air defenses Putin has sent to that peninsula may end up being for naught. Ukraine's deadliest weapon yet has one mission: take out the Crimean bridge that links Crimea to the Russian mainland. If that bridge goes down, Putin's grip on Crimea is destroyed. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering Ukraine's campaign against Russia's refineries. And thank you for watching.